Well, the Babylonian exile was a tragic event for the Hebrew people. The temple was destroyed when the Babylonians came in and conquered Judah. Kingship was removed, and the Hebrew people were deported to the land of Mesopotamia. And so Jewish people were now part of this context of the ancient superpowers of Babylonia and what would become Persia when the Persians defeat and conquer the Babylonians. And so there's this resident Jewish population in Mesopotamia. Some of them choose to return under Cyrus, king of Persia, when they have the opportunity. And there is a migration back to the land of Judah. And we have that story in Ezra, Nehemiah, and prophets Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi are going to deal with that population that returns from the Babylonian exile into the land of Judah. But what about those Jews who remain? What about the Jews who remained in Mesopotamia underneath Persian rule? What is their fate? What is their plight? How does God relate to them? How do they maintain their identity as Jewish people? We have a couple of stories, Daniel being one of them, Esther being another. How do Jewish people live in the diaspora, in that dispersion into Mesopotamia? Daniel gives us one example, really a no-compromise kind of example. Daniel is going to be counterculture in a lot of ways, in his stance, in his posture. He's going to maintain his holiness in terms of his culture, his diet, his religious practice. And so Daniel is one example of how we might live as a Jew in this culture of Mesopotamia. Esther gives us another example. Esther gives us this example of one who, in a sense, is somewhat more accommodating to culture until we reach a crisis point where her identity has to be made known. And she willingly steps up and lets people know that I'm a Jew, I'm a Jewess, and there's an issue here that we need to deal with. And so there are a couple of approaches, perhaps, as we think about Jews in diaspora. Counterculture, Daniel and that stance of resisting, in some cases, the influences of culture, the more accommodating approach of Esther. But what they share in common is this relationship to God, this idea that they know they're still Jewish people and that they still belong under the umbrella of God's covenant. And that's what I think is most important about, or at least very important about Daniel and Esther. Jews in diaspora are still covered by the covenant. God's still going to hear their prayers. God's still going to deliver Daniel and his friends when they are under persecution by the Babylonian king. God will still deliver his Jewish people from the plot of Haman through Esther and Mordecai. And so that issue of diaspora, I think, ultimately is about God is still God of Jews, even though they're removed from temple, they're removed from land of the promise. God still is going to hold them underneath his umbrella of covenant as they live out their lives in Mesopotamia. And I think that's significant as we deal with the issue of Jews outside the land.